You're reading this in an alphabet Rome gave you. If you're counting anything today, you're probably using Roman numerals. And right now, close to 1 billion people speak languages that grew directly out of Latin, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. That's not an empire, that's a fossil, still walking around in our mouths 2,000 years later. The Romans themselves weren't surprised by any of this. By their own reckoning, their state simply was the civilized world. A period later, historians named Pax Romana, the Roman peace, arguably the first working model of globalization the planet ever produced. Here's the strange part. All of it, the language, the law, the roads, the calendar, started as a cluster of huts on a hill nobody wanted, beside a river nobody had bothered to bridge, run by a people who weren't even the strongest group in their own neighborhood. So how does a village that couldn't control its own hill end up running the known world for over 1,000 years? That's what we're actually answering today. And the answer starts unglamorously with letting in everyone else refuse to.
Welcome to Neovaria.
Act 1. A city built for outsiders. Around 3,000 years ago, Latin-speaking farmers settled a cluster of hills beside the Tiber in central Italy. They were not the local superpower. To the north sat the Etruscans, a wealthy civilization whose language still isn't fully decoded. To the south sat Greek colonists, so thick on the ground that the region was nicknamed Greater Greece. Rome sat wedged between both at a river crossing everyone needed. Geography, more than destiny, built this city. From the start, Rome took people in that nobody else wanted: escaped slaves, exiles, debtors, refugees. It offered them citizenship instead of a closed door, a policy that eventually made Rome the largest city in the ancient world. Even its founding myth is a migration story. Romulus and Remus, raised by a wolf, descended from refugees of fallen Troy. The brothers argued over where to build. Romulus killed Remus and named the city after himself. Act 2. Borrowed kings. Borrowed ideas. Tradition says 7 kings ruled early Rome, each credited with a gift: a calendar, a sewer system, a temple to Jupiter. In truth, most of what made Rome function came from somewhere else. The aqueduct, the arch, likely gladiatorial combat, and certainly the alphabet were borrowed, mostly from the Etruscans, who had adapted the Greek alphabet used at the colony of Cumae. Fittingly, Rome's last kings weren't Latin at all, but Etruscan, bringing a level of political organization the farmers hadn't developed on their own. Act 3. A scandal and a republic. In 509 BC, a sex crime ended the monarchy. The king's son assaulted a noblewoman, Lucretia, who took her own life in protest, and the outrage drove the royal family out for good. In place of a king, Rome elected 2 consuls a year, checked by a senate of roughly 300 elders, the patres, or fathers, the root of patrician. Anyone outside those families was a plebeian, permanently barred from office no matter how rich they got. The struggle between the two classes, dragged out over 2 centuries, is essentially how the republic, res publica, the public thing, got built. Plebeians filled the army, and their favorite weapon was simple: walk out of the city and refuse to fight. It worked. Rome created tribunes of the plebs with veto power over the consuls and wrote its first public law code, the 12 Tables, so judges could no longer just invent the rules. By 287 BC, plebeians had won full legal equality, commemorated in a motto still stamped on manhole covers in Rome today, SPQR, the Senate and People of Rome. Act 4. Saved by geese, rebuilt by war. In 390 BC, Rome nearly ended early when Gaulish raiders sacked the city outright. Legend says the guard dogs slept through it and were punished for it every year afterward, while sacred geese woke the defenders in time to save the last stronghold on the Capitoline Hill. The shock triggered a military overhaul. Legions were broken into smaller, more flexible units called maniples, and over the next century Rome absorbed the rest of Italy, not by crushing rivals outright, but by binding them into alliances that became a bottomless source of soldiers. That manpower is what let Roman legions eventually stand up to the deadliest force of the age. King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a relative of Alexander the Great, hired by the Greek city of Tarentum to stop Rome's advance. Pyrrhus beat Rome in battle so many times, at such cost, that his name still gives us Pyrrhic victory. Tarentum fell anyway. Act 5. Carthage must be destroyed. Reaching Sicily put Rome face to face with Carthage, the real superpower of the western Mediterranean. Rome called the Carthaginians Powini, hence the Punic Wars, over a century of conflict that included Hannibal marching war elephants across the Alps to invade Italy directly. Every time Rome crushed its rival, Carthage rebuilt at terrifying speed. The senator Cato the Elder ended every speech he gave on any subject with the same line: Carthage must be destroyed. In 146 BC, Rome finally obliged, the city leveled, its people enslaved. That same year, Rome also flattened Corinth, absorbing Greece and Macedonia and inheriting the wealth of Alexander's shattered empire. Conquering Greece backfired culturally. Greek became the empire's practical second language, and Rome's greatest orator, Cicero, modeled his speeches on the Athenian statesman Demosthenes. Act 6. The Price of Empire. Full citizenship, though, still belonged only to Rome itself, even as soldiers from across Italy filled its legions. Italy's allies demanded equal rights, fought a war over it, and won. It's arguably the decision that separated Rome from every rival power. Where Greek city-states stayed locked in permanent rivalry, Rome kept extending citizenship outward, quietly laying the legal groundwork an empire would need. Victory abroad wrecked the republic at home. Cheap grain and enslaved labor from conquered land bankrupted small farmers who flooded into the city and became the proletarii, people whose only asset by law was their own children, while the rich bought up the abandoned farmland and grew richer still. Rome split into two hostile camps. Act 7. Reform, murder, and armies for hire. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus tried to fix the imbalance as tribunes, proposing land redistribution and free grain for the poor. The Senate's answer was assassination, both brothers killed along with thousands of their supporters, plunging Rome into internal violence. Into the chaos stepped the general Gaius Marius, who opened the army to landless citizens for the first time, promising them land after service. It solved Rome's recruitment crisis and quietly broke the Republic. From here on, legions were loyal to whichever general paid and rewarded them, not to the Senate. Act 8. The Man Who Crossed the River. By 49 BC, two of Rome's greatest generals were on a collision course. Pompey the Great had annexed the east, crushed Spartacus's slave revolt, and cleared the Mediterranean of pirates. Julius Caesar had spent nearly a decade conquering Gaul in a campaign brutal enough that modern historians call it genocide. Roughly 1 million dead, 1 million more enslaved. Roman law required a returning general to disband his army first. Caesar refused, marched his legions across the Rubicon, and triggered a civil war fought between Roman armies on both sides. Within a few years, he'd beaten Pompey and every other rival, installed Cleopatra on Egypt's throne, and fathered a son with her. Back in Rome, he folded consul, tribune, and dictator for life into one man, himself. Rumors spread that he wanted to be king outright. On the Ides of March, 44 B.C., senators stabbed him to death on the floor of the Senate he'd come to dominate. Act 9. One man, 200 years of peace. Caesar's heir was his 18-year-old great-nephew Octavian. Nobody took him seriously until he'd outmaneuvered everyone who didn't. In 31 B.C., he defeated his last rival, Mark Antony, whose lover Cleopatra had by then moved on from Caesar to him. The couple died by suicide, and Octavian was left the sole master of Rome. Caesar had held power 4 years before his murder. Octavian, taking the title Augustus, the revered one, held it for 43. He never formally abolished the Republic. He just gathered every real office into his own hands and called himself, with calculated modesty, Princeps, first citizen. What followed was Pax Romana, 2 centuries without a major civil war. Rome fed free grain to as many as 200,000 people. Augustus reportedly had a lake dug just to stage mock naval battles for entertainment, and had to cap new apartment blocks at roughly 6 stories to stop the city collapsing under its own construction boom. Poets Virgil and Horace, funded by his own culture minister Maecenas, produced work still read today. And with Augustus, a new custom began, worshiping the emperor as something close to a living god. Act 10. Madmen on the throne. The dynasty after Augustus gave historians some of their darkest material. Tiberius ruled through paranoid terror, prosecuting rivals on loosely defined treason charges. Caligula reportedly threatened to make his horse a consul. Claudius, a genuine scholar more interested in history than court politics, was outmaneuvered by his own wives, one publicly notorious, the other, Agrippina, allegedly poisoning him to put her son on the throne. That son, Nero, later had his own mother killed, executed the apostles Peter and Paul, and, whether or not he started the Great Fire of Rome himself, used it as pretext for the empire's first organized persecution of Christians. He eventually took his own life as rivals closed in. Through it all, real power sat increasingly with the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguard, who murdered Caligula, smothered Tiberius, and installed Claudius themselves. Even amid the chaos, the empire kept growing. Roman legions pushed into Britain and founded a trading post on the Thames they called Londinium. Act 11. The Good Emperors. Stability returned under Vespasian, grandson of an Italian farmer, a background historians actually approved of. He and his son Titus crushed a Jewish revolt so thoroughly that almost nothing survived of Jerusalem's Second Temple but its western wall. Titus then opened the Colosseum, seating roughly 50,000 spectators, and still earned the nickname the delight of the human race, largely for his response to the eruption of Vesuvius, which buried Pompeii not long after. The 2nd century is remembered as the age of the good emperors. Trajan pushed the empire to its largest size ever and connected it with roads so extensive that parts of modern Europe's highway map still trace them. Hadrian switched to defense, building a 73-mile wall across northern Britain that still bears his name, and raised Rome's Pantheon, its concrete dome the largest unsupported dome on Earth for over 1,000 years. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, fought frontier wars for most of his reign, and between campaigns wrote the private notebook of Stoic philosophy we now know as Meditations. His son Commodus preferred performing as a gladiator to governing, and was eventually strangled in his bath by his own wrestling partner, ending the Pax Romana on an almost absurd note. Act 12. Chaos and a new kind of emperor. The century that followed was chaos, a rotating cast of soldier emperors raised and murdered by their own armies, one of whom reportedly bought the throne at auction. In the middle of it, In 212 AD, Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to nearly every free person in the empire, quietly redefining what Roman even meant. You could now be a full citizen in Britain, Egypt, or Syria without ever setting foot in Italy. By the century's end, entire provinces were breaking away. Order returned with Diocletian, son of a freed slave, who rose from ordinary soldier to absolute ruler. He split the empire into 4 zones under 4 co-rulers, sidelined Rome's now ceremonial Senate, and formalized a shift already underway. The emperor was no longer princeps, first citizen. He was dominus, master, the word a slave used for an owner. Act 13. A cross in the sky. Diocletian's system collapsed into civil war after his retirement, reportedly spent growing cabbages on his estate. The winner was Constantine, who claimed that before a decisive battle in 312 AD, he saw a Christian symbol in the sky, promising victory. Whatever really happened, he legalized Christianity, ending 3 centuries of intermittent persecution, and began building a new capital in the east, Constantinople. Later, Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the empire's official religion, and was the last man to rule a united Rome. After his death, his son split it for good between East and West. The eastern half survived another 1,000 years. We know it today as Byzantium. Close, the baker and the founder. The western half wasn't so lucky. Waves of migration finally overwhelmed it, and in 476 AD, its last emperor was deposed. His name, almost too fittingly, was Romulus, the same name as the city's mythical founder over 1,000 years earlier. Near the Colosseum and the ruins of the Forum stands a strange weathered tomb, built for neither an emperor nor a senator, but a baker named Julius. Born a slave to Greek migrants, freed at some point, he grew wealthy enough from government bread contracts to build himself and his wife a monument that still stands 2,000 years on. In most ancient societies, you died exactly what you were born. Julius Caesar's life is the real answer to how a village that couldn't control its own hill built a state that lasted over 1,000 years by building itself from the very start, out of outsiders.